The night carried a quiet stillness, the kind that made every sound sharper, every light brighter, and in that stillness, the hum of a car moved smoothly along the nearly empty road. The driver sat calmly behind the wheel, his thoughts simple, his journey ordinary, until sudden flashes of red and blue broke through the darkness, dancing across his mirrors and flooding his eyes with their piercing glare. His heart skipped, but his hands remained steady as he slowed the car and eased it to the side of the road. For a moment, silence returned, broken only by the soft ticking of his engine. Yet the presence of those lights carried a weight heavier than sound. He lowered his window slightly, feeling the night air press against his skin, and waited with quiet patience. He was not a man of panic, though the situation carried its own tension. Two figures stepped out of the cruiser behind him, their shadows long against the pavement, their boots striking with sharp authority that echoed in the night. The driver took a breath, calm but alert, knowing that moments like these could turn in ways one never expected. His fingers tapped lightly against the steering wheel, not out of nerves, but as a rhythm of focus, each beat reminding him to remain composed. The officers drew closer, their flashlights cutting across the interior of his car, brushing over his face, his jacket, the empty seat beside him. To any passerby, it might have looked like an ordinary stop, a routine check, nothing to mark it different from hundreds of others. But beneath the quiet surface was something that would shift the air, something that no one present was ready for. The driver's eyes flicked once to his mirror, meeting the pale beam of light, then returned forward with calm stillness. His breathing slowed, his posture steady, as though he carried a secret the night itself could not yet reveal. The flashing lights reflected off the glass, bouncing colors into the empty street, making the moment feel both ordinary and heavy with meaning. He did not know the exact reason for the stop, nor did he show any sign of frustration or fear. Instead, he waited with the patience of someone who understood that sometimes silence speaks louder than words. Around him, the world was hushed, but inside the quiet beat of his heart was a story waiting to unfold, one that would soon draw eyes wide, shift voices low, and change the meaning of that stop forever. The footsteps grew louder as the officers neared, their flashlights still sweeping across the car like searchlights cutting through darkness. And with every step the air seemed to grow heavier. When they reached his door, their faces were unreadable, firm with duty. Voices clipped and sharp as one of them ordered him to step out of the vehicle. The words were not shouted, yet they carried a weight that demanded obedience, leaving no space for questions or hesitation. The driver nodded once, his hands moving slowly, deliberately, as if to show he had nothing to hide. He unlatched the seatbelt with a soft click, opened the door, and stepped out, the gravel crunching faintly under his shoes. The cold night air wrapped around him, but he stood tall, his movements steady, his eyes calm, yet quietly observant. He did not argue or plead, though the situation carried an edge of tension that could not be ignored. The officers watched him closely, one hand resting near a holster, the other holding a flashlight that painted his features in harsh light, but he did not flinch under their gaze. Instead, he straightened his back, his posture composed, his silence almost unsettling in its control. He had been through moments of pressure before, and this, though unfair and sharp in its treatment, was not one to shake him. The street was empty except for them, the night sky above silent witness to a scene that seemed to stretch time itself. As one officer circled around him, scanning the car through the windows, the other repeated questions with an edge in his tone, as though waiting for a crack in his calm. But the driver gave only short, clear answers, never raising his voice, never letting frustration slip through. His quiet watchfulness spoke louder than words, as if he understood that sometimes restraint was the strongest shield. The air between them thickened, heavy with suspicion on one side and patience on the other, an unspoken clash of power and composure. Though he stood alone, the driver seemed far from powerless. his silence carrying a weight that unsettled the authority pressed upon him. He had stepped out as instructed, his calm obedience shielding the storm of assumptions swirling around him. But beneath the surface of his stillness lay something far greater than compliance, something waiting for the right moment to be revealed, something that would soon turn the balance of this tense encounter upside down. The night air grew heavier as the officer's hand reached for the cuffs. The metallic rattle loud in the silence of the street, a sound that seemed sharper than any words spoken so far. The driver had done everything they asked, stepped out quietly, answered without resistance, kept his hands visible, and his tone steady yet still. The cold steel closed around his wrists, with a finality that made his breath hitch for only a second. The click of the lock was harsh, echoing like a verdict, and in that moment, the stillness of the night was broken by the faint gasps of onlookers who had gathered at the edges of the sidewalk. A small group of bystanders, drawn by the flashing lights, now stood frozen, their murmurs growing as they watched the man who had shown no threat, no defiance, suddenly bound as though he were dangerous. Whispers carried in the air, blending with the hum of idling engines and the occasional hiss of the breeze, creating an atmosphere charged with unease. The driver did not struggle, did not lift his voice. Though the cuffs bit against his skin with each slight movement, their weight, both physical and symbolic. He lowered his gaze briefly, not in shame, but in measured thought, his silence louder than any protest could have been. One officer guided him toward the car, his grip firm but not cruel. Yet the image it created of a man restrained, led in chains spoke volumes to the crowd. Faces shifted between confusion, discomfort, and quiet indignation. Some whispered that it felt wrong, others looked away, unwilling to face the tension head-on. Through it all, the driver stood steady, his composure unbroken. Though the unfairness of the moment pressed heavily against him, his calm in the face of humiliation unsettled more than anger would have, as though he carried within him a truth the others had not yet discovered. The metallic glint of the cuffs caught the flashing lights of the police car, reflecting sharp beams that danced across the street like silent accusations. The murmurs of the bystanders thickened, their whispers carrying a question none dared to speak aloud. Who was this man, and why did his quiet dignity make the scene feel so wrong? The officers continued their procedure, but even they seemed faintly aware of the shift in the air, the crowd watching, the silence deepening, the sense that something unseen was about to break through the tension. Bound and silent, the driver waited, his eyes steady, as if he knew that the cuff symbols of suspicion and haste would not be the final mark left on this night, but only the beginning of a truth that was soon to surface and leave everyone speechless. The street seemed to hold its breath as the cuffs locked into place, the flashing lights washing over faces that had gone pale with unease. People stood frozen on the sidewalk, their chatter dying into silence, as if no one quite knew what to make of the scene unfolding before them. Some felt pity as they watched the man who had obeyed every command, standing quietly with his hands bound behind him like a criminal. Others felt confusion, glancing at one another, unsure why suspicion had fallen so heavily on someone who carried himself with calm and dignity. The night that had been ordinary only moments ago now felt heavy, as though a storm were building, not in the sky but in the hearts of those who witnessed what they could not explain. The driver did not raise his voice or resist. His eyes stayed lowered, his expression unreadable, as though he bore the weight of the moment with a patience that few could understand. His silence was unsettling, not weak, but purposeful, as though he knew words would mean little here. The crowd shifted uneasily, whispers rippling through them like small waves, but none dared step forward. Even the officers seemed aware of the stillness that had settled, their hands moving with more tension than before, their eyes flicking briefly to the crowd that now stared back at them. Every second stretched longer than the last, the man's quiet composure becoming more striking against the flashing lights. and the tight grip of authority that surrounded him. The silence was not empty. It was full of unspoken questions and growing unease, and though no one said it aloud, the thought echoed in many minds: was this justice, or was it something else? The stillness of the driver, his calm acceptance in the face of humiliation, spoke louder than protests could have, drawing the attention of every heart in that moment. A few in the crowd lowered their eyes, ashamed to watch, while others held their gaze firmly on him, as if trying to understand the strength behind his silence. The air itself felt tense, as though waiting for something to shift, for the truth to reveal itself in a way no one expected. And through it all, the man stood steady, his silence a quiet storm, carrying more meaning than anyone could yet grasp, a silence that would soon demand to be broken in a way none of them would forget. The man stood still, his wrists bound in the cold steel cuffs, but his voice came out calm, even gentle, cutting through the heavy silence that had taken over the street. Without anger or bitterness, he asked the officers to check his inside pocket. The words carried a quiet confidence that made the crowd lean closer, curious about what could possibly be hidden there. One officer stiffened, hesitating as if unsure whether to follow the request, glancing at his partner with uncertainty. The night air seemed thicker in that pause, every eye in the crowd locked on the exchange, every second stretching longer than it should. Finally, with a reluctant motion, the officer reached into the man's coat and pulled out a worn leather wallet. The crowd leaned forward, whispering, waiting for something they could not name. With a flick of his hand, the officer opened it, and there, gleaming beneath the streetlights, was a polished federal badge that shone with authority and weight. The moment felt unreal. The same man who had been treated as though he were guilty stood revealed as someone of great honor and responsibility. Gasps broke the silence, sharp and sudden, spreading like sparks through dry grass. The officer holding the wallet froze, his eyes widening as the truth struck him harder than any reprimand could. His partner stepped closer, peering at the badge as if to confirm what his mind could not accept, and the crowd erupted into low murmurs that carried disbelief, shock, and a touch of shame. The man, however, remained still, his calm composure unbroken, watching quietly as the realization rippled through those around him. He had never raised his voice, never fought back, never lashed out, yet in that single moment, the power of truth outweighed every suspicion and every chain. The officers' hands trembled slightly, their authority suddenly fragile under the weight of what they now knew. The federal badge was more than metal. It was proof of sacrifice, service, and a life dedicated to protecting the very people who had just doubted him. The scene that had begun with flashing lights and cold cuffs now shifted into something entirely different. The silence replaced by the undeniable truth that had been hidden in plain sight, and though the badge lay in the officer's hands, it was the driver's quiet strength that held the room, commanding respect without a single demand. The street that had felt tense with suspicion only moments before now carried the hum of revelation, as everyone, officers, bystanders, and strangers alike, realized they had misjudged a man whose dignity had never wavered, even in chains. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. The crowd that had gathered stood frozen, their whispers cut short, their eyes wide and unblinking as the truth settled in. The officers who had cuffed the man stood like statues, their grip loosening, their expressions shifting from hard authority to raw disbelief. The leather wallet in one hand suddenly felt unbearably heavy, its contents exposing a mistake they could not undo. The shining federal badge gleamed under the dim glow of the streetlight, reflecting not only the truth, but also their error for all to see. Around them, people who had assumed guilt now stared in silence, struggling to reconcile the man in handcuffs with the protector his badge revealed him to be. The officers exchanged a quick glance, their faces pale, their controls slipping like sand through fingers. One of them opened his mouth as if to speak, but no words came, only the sharp sound of his own breath. The driver, still standing calmly, lowered his eyes, as though he carried not anger, but a quiet sadness, a weight heavier than the cuffs around his wrists. That stillness only added to the tension, for it made the officer's actions feel louder, more brutal, even though no one spoke of it aloud. The silence of the crowd pressed in like a wall, the kind that grows unbearable until someone dares to break it, yet no one moved. It was as if the air itself understood the gravity of the mistake, holding every person still in its grip. In the minds of those watching, questions formed but stayed unspoken. How could such a man, a federal protector, be treated with such suspicion? The answer was plain, but the truth was painful, and it hung in the air, unrelenting. The officer's hands twitched, the handcuffs suddenly looking more like chains of shame than tools of duty. The badge that had silenced everyone now seemed to roar louder than their authority ever had. And in the middle of it all stood the man, a figure of patience and strength, reminding them without words that respect was not demanded by shouting or force, but earned through truth and dignity. The moment stretched on, a long heartbeat of stillness, as the weight of what had happened settled deeper into every soul present, leaving them restless, humbled, and unable to look away. The officer's hands trembled slightly as he fumbled with the cold metal of the handcuffs, finally clicking them open and letting the driver's wrists go free. A hush fell over the street, heavier than the silence that had come when the badge was revealed. The man slowly rubbed his wrists, not with anger, but with a quiet awareness of the injustice that had just occurred. Every eye in the crowd lingered on him, noticing the calm in his movements, the way his shoulders remained squared and his head held high despite the humiliation he had endured moments before. He did not shout, did not scold, and did not demand apologies. Instead, he exuded a dignity that seemed to stretch beyond the physical act of removing the cuffs. The officer who had locked him up shifted uncomfortably, feeling the weight of his mistake like a stone pressing on his chest, while the other officer's hands rested stiffly at his sides, unsure of how to act or what to say. Passersby, who had gathered, lingered, holding their breath as if witnessing a quiet miracle unfold. How a man could be wronged so publicly and yet maintain such composure. The driver's calm presence seemed to fill the space, carrying more weight than anger or harsh words ever could. Each measured movement, every patient glance toward the officers, reminded them and everyone watching that authority and respect were not simply given or assumed, they were earned through action, character, and integrity. Slowly, the tension that had gripped the street began to ease, replaced by an unspoken acknowledgement of his strength. Whispers passed through the crowd, but they were not the mocking murmurs from moments before. They were words of recognition, astonishment, and quiet admiration. Even the officers, though embarrassed, felt a shift in their understanding, a sense that their role was not just to enforce rules blindly, but to see clearly and act with discernment. The driver finally straightened fully, his hands now free, and the calm in his eyes invited not fear, but respect. The air seemed lighter, almost as if the street itself exhaled in relief. His silence spoke volumes, showing that sometimes the greatest authority lies not in raising one's voice, but in holding steady, in choosing patience over reaction, and in demonstrating strength without aggression. For those who witnessed it, the lesson was clear and lasting. True respect is returned when humility meets character, when grace prevails over anger, and when a person's presence alone can command acknowledgement without the need for confrontation. The driver walked slowly back to his car, each step measured, leaving behind a crowd that now looked at him differently, their earlier assumptions replaced by a quiet reverence they could not put into words, forever changed by the example of dignity, standing calmly in the aftermath of injustice. The street remained still, the earlier noise of tires and murmurs fading into a heavy, almost tangible silence as the realization sank into everyone present. What had seemed like a routine traffic stop had transformed into something far greater, a moment that forced each witness to confront the fragility of assumptions and the danger of judgment without knowing the truth. Eyes that had once glanced with suspicion now widened with understanding, and those who had whispered in judgment found their voices caught in their throats. The driver, calm and composed, had become more than a man in handcuffs. He had become a reflection of integrity, patience, and quiet authority, showing that appearances can deceive and that character is revealed only through action. The officers who had hastily acted now felt the weight of their error, a silent acknowledgement of the consequences that rushed decisions and unconscious bias can bring, even when intentions are meant to maintain order. Around them, bystanders absorbed the lesson without a single word being spoken, each mind racing with the understanding that life often tests perceptions in unexpected ways. Mothers held their children a little closer, realizing that the lessons they teach about fairness and respect could not be left to assumptions. Pedestrians shifted uneasily, aware that their judgments, even small ones, could ripple into real consequences for someone's life and dignity. The calm presence of the driver, unshaken by humiliation, had done more than free himself from mental restraints. He had unlocked a moment of reflection, forcing everyone to consider how quickly they leaped to conclusions based on skin color, demeanor, or circumstance. The silence stretched, heavy yet enlightening, as if the street itself had absorbed the weight of the truth and allowed it to settle slowly into each heart and mind. Whispers of astonishment, respect, and guilt mingled in the air, though no one dared speak too loudly. The lesson was too profound, too raw, to be interrupted by chatter. In that pause, the power of patience, composure, and integrity revealed itself as a force far stronger than any raised voice, any command, or any hasty action. Each person present felt it in their own way, the shame of misjudgment, the relief of clarity, and the quiet inspiration to act differently in the future. The driver's calm exit, hands finally free, left behind more than an empty street. It left a living memory, a mirror that showed the danger of acting without understanding, and the transformative strength of maintaining dignity even in the face of unfair treatment. The moment would linger in the minds of those who witnessed it, a silent yet indelible reminder that justice and respect must be rooted in truth, that assumptions can mislead, and that grace can teach lessons far deeper than words ever could. The tension on the street was almost tangible as the senior officer slowly straightened, his shoulders stiff with a mix of shame and the weight of responsibility. All eyes were on him, watching closely as he approached the man who had been so unfairly restrained just moments before. His hand rose, quivering slightly at first, then steadied as he executed a formal salute, the kind that spoke of honor, respect, and acknowledgement of wrongdoing. The gesture was deliberate and heavy with meaning, a wordless apology carried through action rather than speech, meant not just for the driver, but for the gathering crowd who had witnessed the injustice unfold. The driver's eyes met the officer's without anger or reproach, holding a calm dignity that seemed to still the very air around them. In that silent exchange, the street seemed to pause, every onlooker sensing the gravity of the moment, the lesson in respect, humility, and human decency that needed no words. The officer's salute trembled at first, betraying the inner tension, but as he held it, he sent a clear message that he recognized his error, that he understood the cost of judgment without knowledge, and that he was choosing to honor the man before him properly. The driver's response was subtle, yet profound, a nod of quiet acknowledgement, a steady gaze, a composed presence that communicated forgiveness without boasting, reinforcing that true dignity comes from character, not reaction. The silence that followed was heavy, but it carried a weight far greater than the whispers and gasps of earlier moments. It was a moment of shared recognition, where justice and respect converged in a simple, human act. Every bystander, whether police officer or civilian, seemed to hold their breath, taking in the lesson in humility and accountability. The officer's body language softened as he lowered his hand, his expression a mix of reverence and remorse. Fully aware that this small act of apology was a bridge between authority and empathy, between fear and understanding, the driver remained composed, allowing the officer's gesture to speak for both of them, demonstrating that true strength is measured in grace under pressure, and that respect earned through recognition of truth holds far more power than authority enforced through fear. In those few silent moments, the city street became a classroom without walls, teaching all present that acknowledgement of mistakes and the courage to correct them can transform even a moment of tension into one of lasting human connection and insight. A reminder that dignity and respect are rights everyone deserves, regardless of circumstance or appearance. That night, as the city settled into the quiet hum of evening, the story of what had happened on the street began to travel from one corner to another, carried in hushed tones at first, then louder, until it reached ears that could not ignore its weight. People spoke not of the initial fear or the tension, but of the lesson that had unfolded before them, a story that held more meaning than mere gossip or rumor. Each retelling captured the same key moments: the calm presence of the driver, the sudden shock of those who had handcuffed him, the revealing of the federal badge, and most importantly, the powerful silence and dignity that followed. Street vendors, shopkeepers, and neighbors shared the story, emphasizing how a single act of recognition and respect could shift a tense moment into one of understanding, teaching patience, humility, and the courage to see beyond assumptions. The tale reminded everyone that appearances can be misleading, that judgments made in haste often carry unintended consequences, and that true strength lies in composure and grace under pressure. Children listened wide-eyed as elders recounted how the senior officer had saluted, how the driver responded with calm dignity, and how the crowd, previously filled with whispers and tension, had become witnesses to a moment of real human connection. Every retelling reinforced the idea that respect is not something forced or demanded, is earned through understanding, empathy, and the willingness to pause before acting. In restaurants, homes, and workplaces, the story became a quiet lesson in reflection, prompting conversations about fairness, the dangers of prejudice, and the power of acknowledgement. People began to see that a single moment, when handled with integrity, can ripple outward, changing perceptions and leaving a lasting impression far beyond the original scene. Even those who had initially doubted or misjudged the driver found themselves reconsidering the assumptions they had made in their own lives, recognizing the value of humility and the quiet strength of character. By the time the night had deepened and the streets were calm again, the story had taken on a life of its own, no longer tied solely to one man or one officer, but as a universal reminder, patience, respect, and dignity revealed truths far stronger than fear or prejudice ever could. In the soft glow of streetlights, the lesson echoed in homes and hearts alike, a story passed along not as shame for the mistake, but as celebration for the lesson it left behind, a lesson that would remain in memory, quietly shaping behavior and inspiring respect long after the night had ended.